My fiancé said his gaming buddy understood him better than me, so I let him move in with her instead. Trevor came home from his gaming tournament drunk and wouldn't stop talking about Raven. He'd been playing online with her for 8 months, but this was the first time they'd met in person at the convention downtown. He stumbled through our apartment door at 2 a.m., waking me up with his loud recounting of how incredible she was in real life, how she understood gaming strategy better than anyone he'd ever met, how she actually listened when he explained his theories about game mechanics while I always zoned out, how she laughed at his jokes about respawn times and loot drops while I just smiled politely, not getting the references. He said Raven got his real personality, the passionate gamer part of him, while I only saw the guy who worked IT support and paid half the rent. He actually used those words, my real personality, like the person he'd been with me for 3 years was some kind of performance. Then he said maybe he'd been wrong about us, that maybe he needed someone who understood his world, someone like Raven. I asked if he was having an affair, and he laughed, saying gaming partnerships weren't about lovemaking, they were about connection, which somehow felt worse. The next morning, Trevor didn't remember the conversation, or claimed he didn't. He made coffee and asked what I wanted to do that weekend like nothing had happened, but I remembered every word. I started paying attention to how much time he spent gaming with Raven after that. It was every night, sometimes 4 or 5 hours straight. I'd come home from my nursing shifts exhausted, and he'd barely look up from his screen. Just a quick hey babe before diving back into whatever dungeon or raid they were running. I'd hear him through his headset, praising Raven's tactics, laughing at her commentary, staying up until 3 a.m. because they were so close to beating this level. When I asked him to spend time with me instead, he'd get defensive, say I didn't understand how important his gaming community was, that Raven and his other teammates depended on him, that I was being clingy and insecure. He made me feel crazy for being bothered by how much he talked about another woman. Then I met Raven at another gaming convention 2 months later. Trevor had asked me to come, probably to prove he had nothing to hide. She was exactly what I'd pictured. Mid-20s, purple-streaked hair, wearing a vintage game t-shirt, and confidently holding court with a group of male gamers. When Trevor introduced me as his fiancé, Raven barely glanced at me. She immediately pulled Trevor into a conversation about some new game expansion, physically angling her body to exclude me. Later, I overheard her call Trevor her gaming soulmate to some other players, laughing about how rare it was to find someone so in sync with your playstyle. She knew details about Trevor's life I'd never shared with anyone, how his parents had divorced when he was 12, how he'd struggled with anxiety in college, how much he'd spent on his custom gaming PC. He'd told her everything while barely asking about my 12-hour shifts saving lives in the emergency room. When I confronted Trevor about sharing intimate details with Raven, he said I was overreacting, that gaming friends talk about personal stuff. It's part of building team trust. He said Raven was just a friend who happened to be good at games, and I was being jealous over nothing. He actually suggested I should be grateful she kept him happy and engaged with his hobby instead of getting depressed like he used to before he found his gaming community. He said I should thank her for making him less stressed about work. The gaslighting was so smooth I almost believed him, almost convinced myself I was being the unreasonable one for feeling uncomfortable with their relationship. But then I checked our credit card statement and found charges I didn't recognize. Gaming equipment shipped to an address across town. Subscriptions to premium gaming services for 2 accounts. Late-night food deliveries to that same address during times Trevor said he was gaming alone in our apartment. I drove to the address on a Wednesday afternoon while Trevor was at work. It was a small apartment in a complex near the university. I sat in my car for an hour before Raven came out, wearing pajama pants and one of Trevor's gaming tournament shirts that I'd never seen before. She got in her car and drove away, and I sat there processing what it meant that she had his clothes. When I confronted Trevor that night, he had an explanation ready. He'd loaned her the shirt after she'd spilled something on hers at a gaming event. The equipment was a loan because her setup had crashed. The food deliveries were for the whole gaming group when they met up for in-person sessions. Every answer was reasonable enough to make me doubt myself, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I told him I was uncomfortable with the level of involvement, and he sighed like I was being exhausting. Asked why I couldn't just support his friendships. Said Raven was important to him, and I needed to accept that. That's when I decided to give Trevor exactly what he wanted. A choice. I told him I was planning a dinner party for the 3 of us. He looked nervous but agreed, probably thinking he could prove their friendship was innocent. I spent the week preparing, not just food, but documentation. I printed out credit card statements with highlighted charges, screenshots of their gaming chat logs from his computer when he'd left it unlocked, showing conversations that went way beyond game strategy, messages where Raven called him babe and said she missed him, where Trevor complained about me not understanding him, where she sent him photos in cosplay outfits asking his opinion, where he told her she looked amazing. I organized everything in a folder and waited for Friday night. Raven arrived wearing a short dress and makeup, clearly trying to impress. She'd brought wine and acted like this was a casual friend dinner, hugging Trevor a bit too long. During the meal, I was perfectly pleasant while asking innocent questions. How did she afford her apartment on a retail job? Trevor had been helping with rent for 3 months after her roommate moved out. How did she get such an expensive gaming setup? Trevor had co-signed a credit card for her to buy equipment, who helped her move furniture last month. Trevor had taken a vacation day to help while I was working a double shift at the hospital. Every answer made Trevor's face go paler. After dessert, I pulled out the folder and presented them both with a proposition. Since Trevor felt Raven understood him better than I did, and since they were clearly more than gaming friends, they should make it official. I would break off our engagement, Trevor could move in with Raven, and everyone would get what they wanted. Trevor immediately backtracked, saying I was being crazy and misunderstanding everything. But Raven's face told a different story. She looked at Trevor with this hopeful expression and said maybe it wasn't the worst idea. That Trevor had been complaining about me for months, about how I didn't appreciate his gaming, how I worked too much, how I didn't understand his passions like she did. She said they were more compatible anyway. Trevor's expression shifted from defensive to panicked as Raven kept talking, digging them both deeper. She mentioned all the times Trevor had called her after fights with me, how he'd said he felt more himself around her, how they'd talked about what it would be like if he wasn't engaged. I watched Trevor realize that Raven had interpreted their relationship very differently than he'd claimed to me, that maybe his innocent gaming friendship had been an emotional affair all along, and now it was being exposed. I pulled out the lease termination notice I'd already prepared. Our apartment lease was in my name only since I'd moved in first, and added him later. I gave him 30 days to move out. Then I showed them the financial breakdown. Half of everything we'd shared would need to be settled. The furniture we'd bought together, the savings account, the wedding deposits he'd convinced me to put down. But more importantly, I'd calculated every dollar he'd spent supporting Raven over the past 3 months. The rent help, the equipment, the food, the subscriptions. It totaled nearly $4,000 of our shared money spent on another woman. Money I'd contributed from my nursing salary while working overtime. I told him he could have his gaming soulmate, but he'd be starting that relationship in debt and explaining to Raven why he suddenly couldn't afford to help her anymore. Raven's enthusiasm disappeared fast when she understood the financial reality. She'd thought Trevor had his own money, didn't realize he'd been spending our shared funds. She asked how much he actually made at his IT job, and when he told her, her face fell. She started backtracking, saying maybe she'd misunderstood the situation, that she didn't want to cause problems in our relationship. Trevor tried to salvage both relationships at once, telling me he'd never meant for things to go this far, telling Raven that he'd been confused and emotional, but I was done. I told them both to get out of my apartment. Trevor tried to argue, but I reminded him the lease was mine, the furniture was mostly mine, and I had documentation of financial infidelity that would be very interesting to his parents who'd been helping us save for the wedding. He grabbed his keys and left with Raven following, both of them stunned into silence. The next morning, Trevor started texting. He said he'd stayed at a friend's place and we needed to talk, that Raven had misunderstood their friendship, and he'd been drunk and stupid when he said she understood him better. I didn't respond. He called 6 times before I finally answered and told him he had 30 days to get his things out, and that I was keeping the engagement ring since I'd paid for half of it despite it being his proposal. He said I was being vindictive and throwing away 3 years over a misunderstanding. I asked him which part was the misunderstanding. The $4,000 spent on another woman, the intimate conversations about our relationship problems, or telling her she understood him better than his fiancé did. He had no answer for that. I hung up and blocked his number, then called his mother to explain why the wedding was off. She was horrified when I told her about the financial details and the emotional affair. She promised to help ensure Trevor moved out peacefully. Trevor showed up 3 days later with his brother to start packing his things. I'd taken the day off work to supervise, making sure he only took what was actually his. He tried multiple times to start conversations about reconciliation, about how we could work through this. His brother stayed quiet but looked uncomfortable, probably hearing Trevor's version first and now seeing the reality. I gave Trevor a box of printed evidence. Every chat log, every financial transaction, every lie he'd told about where he was or what he was doing. I told him I'd kept copies, and if he tried to contest anything in the separation or spread lies about why we broke up, I'd make sure everyone saw the truth. He took the box and left without arguing, probably realizing he had no defense. His brother helped him carry the last boxes to his car, and then they were gone. The apartment felt bigger and quieter without his presence, without his gaming setup taking over the living room, without the constant noise of his headset conversations. The first week alone was harder than I expected, not because I missed Trevor, but because I was processing how much of myself I'd minimized to accommodate him, how many shifts I'd worked while he gamed, how many times I'd eaten dinner alone because he was too focused on raids to eat with me, how often I'd gone to bed alone because he'd promised just one more game that turned into 4 more hours. I'd been so busy being understanding, being the cool girlfriend who didn't nag about hobbies, that I'd let him treat me like an afterthought. I called my best friend Simone and told her everything. She was furious on my behalf, said she'd always thought Trevor was selfish but hadn't wanted to interfere. She came over with wine and takeout, and we spent the night talking about all the red flags I'd ignored, how he'd slowly stopped planning dates, how he'd stopped asking about my work, how everything had become about his needs, his hobbies, his comfort. 2 weeks after Trevor moved out, his mother called. She'd apparently had a long conversation with him about respect and responsibility. She told me she was embarrassed by her son's behavior and that she'd raised him better than this. She said she'd given him money to pay me back the $4,000 he'd spent on Raven and that she expected him to follow through. She also told me that Trevor and Raven had tried to make it work for about a week before it fell apart. Apparently, without the fantasy of forbidden connection and without Trevor's financial support, they'd realized they had nothing in common beyond video games. Raven had expected him to help her with rent and bills like he'd been doing, and when he couldn't, she'd lost interest fast. Trevor was now living with a different friend, sleeping on a couch, and finally understanding the consequences of his choices. His mother said she hoped I'd move on and find someone who appreciated me, because Trevor clearly hadn't. I received a check in the mail 3 days later for $4,000 with a note from Trevor. It said he was sorry, that he'd been selfish and immature, that he'd taken me for granted, that Raven had been a fantasy built on shared hobbies and late-night conversations where he'd vented about real-life responsibilities, that he realized too late that I'd been supporting him emotionally and financially while he'd been complaining about me to someone who didn't actually care about him as a person. The note asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. I deposited the check and threw away the note. I didn't owe him closure or forgiveness or another chance to explain himself. I'd given him 3 years and an engagement, and he'd spent the last months of it building an emotional affair while spending our money on another woman. Some things couldn't be fixed with an apology and a check from his mother. Simone helped me redecorate the apartment over the next few weeks. We painted the living room a color I actually liked instead of the gray Trevor had insisted on. I bought new furniture to replace the pieces he'd taken, choosing styles that felt like me. I filled the space his gaming setup had occupied with a reading nook and plants. I started going to the gym again, something I'd stopped doing because Trevor had made comments about me spending too much time away from home. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned: painting, hiking, going to concerts. I remembered who I'd been before I'd started shrinking myself to fit into Trevor's world. The woman who'd gotten through nursing school while working full-time, who'd traveled solo before we met, who'd had ambitions beyond being someone's understanding girlfriend. That woman had gotten lost somewhere in 3 years of accommodating someone who'd never appreciated the accommodation. 4 months after the breakup, I ran into Raven at a coffee shop near the hospital. She was with some other gamers, laughing loudly and showing off her phone. I thought about leaving, but then I realized I had nothing to feel awkward about. I ordered my coffee and sat at a table with my book. Raven saw me and her whole demeanor changed. She looked guilty and uncomfortable, whispering something to her friends. One of them glanced at me and said something I couldn't hear. Raven stood up and walked over to my table, asking if she could talk to me for a minute. I said no, I was reading. She stood there awkwardly for a moment, then said she wanted to apologize. That she hadn't realized how serious Trevor's relationship with me was, that she'd believed him when he said we were basically over. I closed my book and looked at her directly. I told her she'd called him her gaming soulmate at a convention where he'd introduced me as his fiancé. She'd known exactly what she was doing. Raven's face flushed red and she stammered something about being caught up in the excitement of finding someone who shared her interests. I asked her if that excitement was worth helping destroy a 3-year relationship, if the gaming connection was so special that it justified all the lying and sneaking around. She said she'd thought Trevor was going to leave me anyway, that he'd made it sound like he was unhappy and just needed a push. I told her that was what men who cheat always say to the other woman, that she hadn't been special or different, she'd been convenient and willing, that Trevor had treated her just as badly as he'd treated me once the fantasy wore off and reality hit. She looked like she might cry, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just emptiness where there used to be hurt. I told her to leave me alone, picked up my book, and went back to reading. She returned to her table and left with her friends a few minutes later. 6 months after the breakup, Trevor sent me a friend request on social media. I ignored it. He sent a message through a mutual friend asking if we could talk. I told the friend to tell him no. He showed up at the hospital one day, waiting in the parking lot after my shift. I saw him leaning against his car and turned around, walking back inside to call security. They escorted him off the property and warned him not to come back. He sent flowers to my apartment with another apology note. I threw them away without reading the full message. I'd moved on, built a life I actually enjoyed, and he was still trying to find his way back into it. The audacity was almost impressive. After 3 years of being taken for granted, after months of lies and financial betrayal, after everything he'd said about Raven understanding him better, he thought flowers and persistence would work. He thought I'd be waiting, ready to take him back once he'd learned his lesson. My coworker Denise asked me out for drinks one Friday, and I said yes without hesitation. We'd worked together for 2 years but had never socialized outside the hospital. She was funny and sharp and had just gone through her own divorce. We swapped stories about terrible relationships over margaritas, and she told me about the freedom she'd found in being single again. How she'd forgotten what it was like to make decisions based only on what she wanted, to spend money on herself without justifying it, to go where she wanted without checking if someone else approved. I realized I was experiencing the same thing. Without Trevor, I'd started traveling again. I'd taken a weekend trip to the mountains, joined a book club, started painting classes. I was remembering what I liked instead of what we liked as a couple. Denise and I became actual friends after that, not just coworkers. She introduced me to her friend group, and suddenly I had a social life that didn't revolve around Trevor's gaming schedule. 8 months after the breakup, Simone dragged me to a speed dating event. I protested, said I wasn't ready, but she insisted I needed to at least practice talking to men again. The event was awkward and funny, full of people trying too hard or not trying at all. I met a lawyer named David who made me laugh with his terrible jokes, a teacher named Marcus who talked passionately about his students, an accountant named Christopher who admitted he was only there because his sister had forced him. None of them were Trevor, which was exactly the point. I wasn't looking for serious, wasn't trying to replace what I'd lost. I was just remembering that there were good men out there who asked questions and listened to answers, who had lives and interests but still made time for other people, who treated dating like mutual discovery instead of waiting for someone to be impressed by them. I exchanged numbers with Christopher, and we met for coffee the following week. Nothing serious, just conversation. He asked about my job and actually listened when I talked about the ER. He shared stories about his accounting firm without making it his entire personality. It was refreshingly normal. 10 months after the breakup, Trevor's mother called again. She apologized for bothering me but said she felt I deserved to know something. Trevor had been fired from his IT job for spending too much time gaming during work hours. He'd apparently been playing with Raven and others during his shifts, minimizing the window when his boss walked by. After multiple warnings, they'd let him go. He'd moved back in with his parents temporarily while looking for new work. His mother said he'd been depressed, finally understanding what he'd lost and how his priorities had been completely backward. She said she wasn't asking me to take him back or even talk to him, just wanted me to know that consequences had caught up with him in every area of his life. I thanked her for telling me and said I hoped Trevor figured himself out eventually. After we hung up, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because it had taken losing everything for him to see what he'd been doing wrong all along. A year after the breakup, I got a promotion at the hospital, charge nurse position with better pay and better hours. I celebrated with Denise and Simone at my favorite restaurant, toasting to new beginnings and hard-earned success. My apartment was completely mine now, decorated how I wanted, peaceful and organized. I'd started dating Christopher more seriously, though we were taking things slowly. He'd met my friends and they approved. He understood that I had a demanding job and didn't pout when I worked late. He planned actual dates instead of expecting me to sit next to him while he did his hobbies. He asked about my family and remembered details from previous conversations. The bar was literally on the ground after Trevor, but Christopher cleared it easily just by being a decent, attentive person. I wasn't rushing into anything serious, but I was open to possibilities in a way I hadn't been in years. I ran into Trevor at a grocery store on a Sunday morning. He was in the produce section, looking thinner and tired, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt. He saw me and froze, his hand halfway to a bag of apples. I nodded politely and kept shopping, grabbing what I needed from the same area. He followed me to the next aisle and asked if we could talk. I told him there was nothing to talk about. He said he'd been in therapy, working on himself, understanding why he'd sabotaged our relationship, that he'd been using gaming as an escape from adult responsibilities and had gotten lost in it, that Raven had been a fantasy that let him avoid dealing with real issues, that he'd been selfish and immature, and he understood why I'd ended things. I listened without interrupting, then told him I appreciated the self-awareness, but it didn't change anything. He asked if there was any chance of trying again, starting fresh. I said no. He'd spent our relationship making me feel like I wasn't enough, and I'd spent the year after learning I was more than enough for someone who actually valued me. Trevor's face crumpled, and he said he knew he'd ruined the best thing in his life, that every relationship since had made him realize what he'd had with me. I felt nothing hearing this. No victory, no sympathy, just a distant recognition that this person used to matter to me and now didn't. I told him I needed to finish shopping and moved past him. He didn't follow. I checked out and drove home, and by the time I was unpacking groceries, I'd already stopped thinking about the encounter. Christopher came over that evening and we cooked dinner together, something simple and easy. He told me about his week, asked about mine, and we fell into the comfortable rhythm we'd developed. No drama, no feeling like I had to compete for attention. Just two people who enjoyed each other's company. Later, lying in bed, I thought about how different this felt from the last years with Trevor. How I'd convinced myself his neglect was normal. That all relationships eventually became comfortable to the point of invisible. Simone threw me a divorce from a terrible relationship party on the 1-year anniversary of my breakup with Trevor. She invited all our friends, decorated with banners that said, "Congratulations on dodging that bullet," and "New beginnings." We ate too much cake and drank too much wine, and everyone shared their honest opinions about Trevor, that they'd kept quiet during our relationship. How he'd been dismissive of me at parties, always finding an excuse to talk about gaming instead of engaging with my friends. How he'd make little comments about my work schedule like it was an inconvenience to him. How he'd never ask questions about anyone else's lives, just waited for his turn to talk about himself. Hearing it all at once was validating and painful. I'd normalized so much of his behavior, made excuses for him, defended him when friends raised concerns. I'd been so focused on being the cool, understanding girlfriend that I'd let him treat me like a background character in his life. Denise asked me what I'd learned from the whole experience, and I thought about it seriously. I'd learned that understanding someone's hobbies didn't mean accepting neglect. That financial transparency mattered in relationships, that emotional affairs were just as damaging as physical ones, that gaslighting often came wrapped in reasonable explanations that made you doubt your own perceptions, that someone who truly valued you wouldn't make you compete with their hobbies for basic attention. I'd learned that I'd rather be alone than with someone who made me feel alone, that my job wasn't less important than someone's gaming career aspirations, that I deserved someone who was proud of my work, not resentful of my hours. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd thought, that I could walk away from a 3-year relationship and an engagement and rebuild something better instead of clinging to something broken because of sunk costs. Christopher asked me to be his girlfriend officially after we'd been dating for 6 months. We were at dinner, nothing fancy, and he said he wanted to make sure we were on the same page about being exclusive and serious. I said yes, but I also told him about Trevor, about the gaming obsession, the emotional affair, the financial betrayal. I wanted him to understand why I needed transparency and communication, why I'd probably be sensitive about time management and attention. Christopher listened without judgment and said he appreciated me telling him, that he'd be mindful of those concerns and would always be honest with me. He said his ex-wife had cheated on him, so he understood how betrayal changed your ability to trust. We promised each other we'd communicate when something bothered us instead of letting resentment build, that we'd treat each other like priorities, not afterthoughts. It felt like starting from a foundation of mutual respect instead of just attraction and hope. 18 months after the breakup, I heard through mutual friends that Trevor had gotten serious with someone new, a woman from his gaming community who'd moved to our city for work. They'd apparently bonded over their shared love of games and were talking about moving in together. I felt nothing hearing this news. No jealousy, no vindication, no concern for the new woman. Trevor was someone else's problem now, someone else's learning experience. I hoped he'd actually changed like he'd claimed, but I doubted it. People who blamed their partners for their own shortcomings rarely fixed the underlying issues. They just found new partners to blame. I was grateful I'd walked away when I did, before we'd gotten married, before we'd had kids, before I'd invested even more years into someone who didn't appreciate the investment. The woman I was now wouldn't have stayed as long as I had. She would have set boundaries earlier, demanded respect sooner, left faster. Growth was recognizing how far I'd come. 2 years after the breakup, Christopher proposed. We were hiking in the mountains, something we both loved, and he'd packed a picnic with champagne. He told me I'd taught him what partnership looked like, how two people could support each other without losing themselves, that he loved how passionate I was about my nursing career, how I talked about my patients, how I balanced compassion with professionalism. He loved that I was independent but still made time for us, that I challenged him to be better without making him feel inadequate. He pulled out a ring he'd designed with my input months earlier, nothing like the generic ring Trevor had picked out without asking my opinion. I said yes immediately, crying happy tears while he slipped it on my finger. We sat on that mountain for hours, talking about what we wanted for our future. Kids eventually, but not yet. Travel to places we'd both dreamed of visiting, building careers we cared about while making time for each other. It was everything my engagement to Trevor hadn't been. Mutual respect, clear communication, genuine excitement about partnership. The wedding was small and perfect, just close friends and family at a venue overlooking the lake. Simone was my maid of honor, giving a speech about how she'd watched me transform from someone who accepted crumbs to someone who demanded the whole meal. My parents cried, relieved I'd found someone who treated me well after worrying through the Trevor years. Christopher's family welcomed me warmly, and his mother told me privately that she'd never seen her son so happy and present in a relationship. During our first dance, Christopher whispered that he'd spend his life proving I'd made the right choice. I told him he already had, just by showing up consistently and treating me like I mattered. The reception was full of laughter and dancing and people celebrating love that was healthy and mutual. No one mentioned Trevor, though I knew some people were thinking about how different this wedding was from the one I'd been planning 2 years earlier. On our honeymoon in Italy, wandering through Florence's streets with Christopher's hand in mine, I thought about the woman I'd been with Trevor, how small I'd made myself, how much I'd excused, how I'd convinced myself that love meant understanding someone's priorities, even when those priorities never included me. I'd learned that real love was reciprocal, that the right person made space for you in their life without being asked, that hobbies and passions were important, but shouldn't eclipse your partner entirely. Trevor had taught me what I wouldn't accept anymore. Christopher showed me what I deserved. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is someone showing you exactly who they are before you're too committed to walk away. Trevor did me a favor when he said Raven understood him better. He gave me permission to stop trying to be enough for someone who would never think anyone was enough. He freed me to find someone who thought I was everything. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.